Hey guys, hope you're well. So this is in response to a comment made by Chas1422. I think that's your name, off the top of my head. What he said was, because I spoke in another video about need for Islamic humanism and hoping that it emerges, and he said he doesn't think that it is likely because there have been attempts in the past to make more humanistic interpretations of Islam and how one can read the Quran and easily come to the understanding that the understanding of like a hardcore Wahhabi Salafi interpretations of Islam. So what I want to say is that I think things are in a different position now than they were in the past, because I think in the past it was mainly state implemented Islam, and there was not much in terms of intercultural mixing, or there were not the same social pressures in place that there are now, because we have things like international telecommunication, i.e. the internet, we have international travel, we have international media, access to media, right? And we also have things like trade, international travel, and we're a globalized economy. So now I think there are things in place, there are social pressures in place that basically make intermixing it's happening and it's inevitable, right? So I think that's a good social pressure in place for where people will be exposed to different ideologies, different values, different belief systems, different models of reality. And I think that will place a social pressure within the Muslim community, and I believe it actually is placing a social pressure within the community and creating cognitive dissonance within individuals and creating like a almost identity crisis within people, which isn't necessarily a good thing, because I think that can lead to people doubling down and become fundamentalists. But it can lead to people to questioning their particular exclusivist interpretations of religion and non-universalist interpretations of religion, because they'll be exposed to other cultures and think, well, I don't like the notion of a caliphate, of being non-egalitarian, and people who I like who are not Muslims being dhimmis, having second class citizenship, or the notion of slavery being welcomed back, or the threat of death for people who leave a religion or are gay or commit adultery, etc. They'll just sort of some of them I think will come to that conclusion. And I think that's evident in a lot of people who they may believe in Islam as a personal religion, but when it comes to the political ideology of Islam, they actually don't really believe in a caliphate. Like I've said in a previous video, is there are Muslims, like I grew up in, I'm in the UK, and there are Muslims who generally run for left-wing parties like Liberal Democrats and Labour, which support things like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender rights, those kind of things, who definitely would not endorse slavery, and they run and become councillors for those. They actually become representatives of those parties. They vote for left-wing ideologies. And in Bangladesh, I think it was in 2009, 2010, they had the choice to vote in an Islamist party. They chose to vote in, I believe, a social democratic party. And so what I'm saying is that, and that's that's a majority Muslim country. So what I'm saying is there seems to be pressures in place, and things happen within Muslim communities where people are keeping perhaps the conservative, socially conservative ideals of the religion or values of the religion, but when it comes to politics, they're discarding the religion. Perhaps they have the argument that it was maybe applicable for that context or that time, but not now, and that what Islam is, or this political ideology, is a framework to be applied to particular contexts, or their underlying principles, but the principles don't necessarily have to manifest in specific ways, which is one of the things I think, what's the name, Osama Hassan, who works for Quilliam Foundation, who's a scholar, he argues that. So I think there are already examples of that now, of people, of promising trends within Muslim communities. Like I said, in the UK, I just identified, and in Bangladesh, and I'm sure true, and the Arab Spring, they were majority Muslims who were rising up to try to have democracy within their countries. So those are really promising. I think those are really promising trends. In regards to the intellectual tradition get behind the kind of reformation I'm talking about of humanist interpretations, but I'll not only extend that beyond humanism to universalism. Universalism is like a theological or philosophical position that everybody gets saved, essentially. Everyone goes to heaven, everyone goes back to God, that nobody is condemned forever for eternity in hell, or hell doesn't exist, or hell is only a temporary place where you basically just either pay, you sort of like go through to sort of ascend to heaven in a sense. And hell isn't necessarily like fire and brimstone. It's like a place where you go where your overall mindset, if you've been manipulative or destructive or domineering person, is reflected back to you, or you're around people who share that mindset. So basically what I'm saying is that, are there things in place that can help Muslims who may have that perspective? I think there are. There's a tradition within Sufism called esoteric exegesis, or basically an esoteric understanding of the Quran, which is reading the Quran in terms of spiritual allegories for like personal development or spiritual realities. And there's a whole tradition within Sufism about that. Oftentimes what's happened is a lot of scholars say, no, you need to take the literal interpretation and that, and only then it's legitimate. But what they can do, what is, like I said, because it's a legitimate tradition within the religion, it has I think has rich literature within the religion. They can just discard the literal tradition and just take the esoteric allegorical perspective. And there are Muslims who do that, like the Quranists. There's a movement called the Quranist movement, which is Quran only. People who completely disregard the Hadith. They say the Hadith were like created to further an agenda, particularly like a patriarchal agenda, and so they only go by the Quran, and they tend to read the Quran allegorically, and they tend to be a lot more chilled out and humanist Muslims. And there's a whole movement called the Quranists. You can so that tradition is already in place. There's also universalist trends, particularly within Sufism, of believing that anybody, as long as you're generally a decent human being, you can go to heaven. You'll be saved. It's not dependent on the religion. God doesn't really care about the religion. He just cares about whether you're a decent person or not. So there are trends within Sufism with that. So there's that tradition within place too within Islam, and we're having emergence of things like Quilliam. We're having emergence of things like, which are Quilliam Foundation, or Quilliam now it's just called, argues against extremist interpretations of Islam, Islamist interpretations, and argues for humanist interpretations of Islam, for egalitarianism and secularism. And there's a great book called Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris, I forget the title, Islam, something like that, I can't remember the title, but he presents some of the arguments they use on a scriptural level to justify humanist interpretations of Islam. And so there's also the Muslim Reform Movement, which is a group of, was a Muslim organization, and it's a group of Muslim humanists who come together to challenge the fundamentalist or traditional interpretations of the religion. And so there's that organization in place. And like I said, there are trends everywhere. So I think things are in place. There are people also like Jeffrey Lang, Arshad Manji, who also humanist interpretations of Islam, and Tariq Ramadan, I would argue, and people like a very famous scholar within Islam called Hamza Yusuf. And I really respect Hamza Yusuf. I actually still take like spiritual guidance from him. I still listen to some of his stuff, and I think he has brilliant things to say. His earlier stuff is a bit fanatical, he even says that himself. His later stuff, I think, is a lot more inclusive, right? So and he even says he doesn't think Sharia, he doesn't agree with implementing Sharia now, or a caliphate. He thinks it would be a disaster. So he really doesn't. He thinks it was maybe okay for that age in the past, but now definitely not. He's against it, and he said that to a Muslim audience. So the kind of people talking about this taqiyya stuff. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, so there are traditions in place, there are trends in place, and like I said, Hamza Yusuf is a very well-respected scholar in Islam. Also, Tariq Ramadan is well known. He's a humanist. He actually called for a moratorium on hudud punishments. And his plan, he openly says this, was to call for a moratorium for Muslim scholars, and then to argue against that it should be eradicated and scrapped and it's not applicable anymore. But unfortunately, he did ask for a moratorium. It wasn't responded to, but he tried, and I think that's a great trend. So there are people in place. There are people who have. There are intellectuals in place who can argue very eloquently, I believe, and there are traditions in place within the religion. So I do think it is possible for Islam as a community and as a religion to become humanist and to become universalist. I do think it's possible. I think that I agree with a guy who I follow, and I just got back into his videos, and he argues for universalism, and his name's Farhan Qureshi, if I pronounce his name right. And I do think there are trends. The reason why I mentioned him, because he talks about universalism, and I do think there is a trend. Yeah, I'm going to bring it up. I do believe in like a spiritual reality, namely by like near-death experiences and other things as well. But I do think there is a trend or an opportunity or an awakening towards universalist messages of spirituality. So I think on a spiritual level, there's some kind of support for Muslims to embrace universalism and humanism and non-exclusive, like universalist messages, interpretations of the religion. So anyway, I hope that helps. Hope you find my perspective interesting. Take care.